So I'm Dave Bradley. I'm the COO of Steel Media, and you would have seen me on stage a little bit here running Pocket Gamer Connects and some other things. But I've been a journalist for about 25 years, and for some of that time, I edited a number of market-leading titles for things like the film industry. So I edited SFX magazine, and I worked on Total Film magazine and Comic Heroes and things. So I've got a background there. So between us, let's tackle some big topics. This is a big topic. There's a lot to kind of break down. So I'm going to sort of break it down into some areas to sort of distribution, production, and business. Just kind of look about how everything's been affected by this strangest of years while we've been in lockdown. There's some evidence, it seems, that people have turned to media and the arts at this time of crisis. We've been looking at the number of downloads of video games, for instance. Seems to have done particularly well, and some of the analysts are suggesting a bumper year for games. But does that mean that we're all success stories, all branches of the media, we're all winning, right? Is that the case? Let's go around and have a look at some of these things. Has games and TV thrived as much as it seems? And are there areas of the media that haven't done so well? Let's dive back and go around starting with Neil there. Do you want to leap in there? How's this year affected comics? Has it been a bumper year for you guys as well?
So digitally, it was pretty good, but you get a much higher profit margin from print sales, and all comic shops and bookshops were shut for a long period, and production rates really it caused a backlog. But also then you have to cull titles you have, because if you have too many titles out there, people won't buy them. And another thing is Comic-Con conventions, because I'm sure it's the same with games, that you get casual gamers and you get hardcore gamers. At Comic-Con, you meet the real fans. And these people become lifetime buyers of your stuff, and they'll spread your word to everyone else. And they meet you, they discover your products typically at Comic-Con. And I think 3 years ago, I was at 26 weekends of the year. I was away.
Wow.
This year, none. So it's changed things dramatically. But the production, though, has been exactly the same, because it's all remotely done. So that hasn't changed at all. But mostly it's the distribution.
See, that's interesting. Yeah, comics is that kind of print area is something that's been affected, and the physical side of things. Andy, let's go to you. What's your take on it? Are we all success stories here in the digital world? What's your kind of overview of the distribution things? Have games and TV thrived as much as it seems, and what parts of the media haven't worked?
I think the important thing to remember when talking about this is we're still in a bubble right now of all the content that was created before 2020 apocalypse Zoomland happened. So we're still consuming that content, and you can see on Netflix specifically that we're beginning to see a lot more non-English dubbed shows coming on, just because we're content starved. Moving forwards, we're going to see, I think, a huge kind of vacuum almost, or gap, where we've hit that point where everyone went into lockdown and production stopped on everything that was not remote. It was on-site production, and I think we're going to start to see that soon. We obviously won't see it with blockbuster movies for a few months because they're backed up waiting to launch, but no blockbuster movies have been in production, for example. So I think we're really in a bubble right now, in between the point where we're getting to the end of the content that's being created, and we're going to have that point where we're kind of stuck and waiting. We want to consume more.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely come back to that. And actually on that distribution side as well, there's the case that movies that have been completed, like let's say famously the James Bond film, have been stalled because the studios are leery of releasing them this time. Lennon, let's come to you. What's your kind of overview take on this? What are the success stories and what's suffered?
Well, I definitely think that you hit on the right point there, Dave, with regards to a lot of the film releases being stalled, right? Mm-hmm. Even with blockbusters and content that's made, with the distribution outlets closed down, similar to comic books, it's really impossible for studios to make back their investment by launching into the void. And so we saw Disney try with things like Mulan on Disney Plus, and they announced great subscribers yesterday on the Disney Plus service, but that still doesn't make up for the entirety of the cinema chains being closed down and all that box office performance that they've been able to hit on, and that all the movie studios have been able to hit on over the last few years. Games emerge as the winner because we're able to work remote and we're able to continue to make content, but there are still some instances, and even if you look at this week being, the big PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X launch week, Series X is launching without Halo Infinite, and that was chalked up to being partially COVID related. So, games are the winners, but whatever content was made, as Andy said, is making its way out. And where there's been distribution chokeholds or production chokeholds, there are some losers as well, and also on all fronts.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. And I've got a point to speak to that. But actually, I want to go to Houston now as well. You work, Houston, you work a lot across a number of disciplines. What's your take on this? Are we the media wants to tell us that games have been a success, but what is that true? But what else hasn't survived?
Well, I mean, there's always winners and losers, and I think overall, people have leaned into games. I think during this time of crisis. I mean, I know speaking from personal experience, me and my 6-year-old daughter, we downloaded games we would never downloaded just sitting in lockdown in LA, especially during the height of the pandemic. And we've had less time outside, more time inside. Of course, we're going to lean into games more. But that doesn't mean all games are a success, right? I mean, I think what we're seeing obviously is we're in a commoditized market where there's hyper competition amongst games, and the same with the film industry and the television industry. And I think people are doubling down on brand. I think when you have a strong brand in this, those are the big winners. We could all, go watch The Mandalorian. Does that mean everybody watches everything that's streamed? Of course not, right? The brand is the thing that draws the audience. I think the biggest losers out of the this pandemic, obviously, I think are theater chains in the film industry, but particularly independent creators in the film industry as well. Film festivals are the lifeblood of independent filmmakers for awareness and winning awards and getting distribution, and you've seen that bottom out. Same with a music artist with touring. And so what's cool about games is that you don't have to have a live event to make that work, right? So I think overall, we've seen a bump in publishing. People are reading more, and a bump in games because you can do that from home.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, on a point there that you and Lennon both made, an interesting thing about games is that, similar to what you were saying about winners and losers and The Mandalorian, the fact that games overall is up this year, and news who are saying it's going to $170 billion or whatever, that's not for everyone. In fact, actually, there's good evidence that people are snacking more on games, right? They're just trying loads out. It doesn't mean they're actually spending in every one of those games. And but definitely, I think there are certainly going to be some losers on the physical event side of things. Neil mentioned conventions and and that sort of thing. We're also looking, as you say, cinema chains. Cineworld already gone, right? Which is many thousands of jobs, unfortunately. So let's talk. We touched on, everyone touched there on kind of production. Let's go and talk about that, about how the kind of working culture in media has changed. Many of us work from home now. I think a number of people on the panel mentioned that that's doable on the game side of things. But collaborative industries like music and filmmaking, much harder to do. So what do we see in the kind of shift there? Andy mentioned a backup of content. Is technology going to save us with the quarantine? Do we see a technology change in the way that we do things, whether that's about distribution or whether that's production? Mandalorian, of course, famously using kind of virtual sets. What do we make of that? How is the working culture of media going to change, and is technology going to help us out there? I'm going to come to you, Neil, and give us an insight there on the kind of comics and publishing world. What do you think? Is the culture of media changing, and is technology the answer?
I think for comics, it changed much earlier than the other industries because you didn't need to have people working together.
Right.
Marvel famously did it with the bullpen, where the writers would have very sketchy outlines. The artists would then just draw it, and the artists would come over and have a look, and then just add the dialogue and change things later. But that's back in the 60s and 70s. Since we've been doing this, there are artists I've worked with for almost 8 years. I've never met them, based in Sri Lanka. Just one thing about the pandemic, there's one guy in Libya, and because of the power cuts there and the heat, he can only get rolling electricity 4 hours a day. So we worried about our lockdown. There's always someone worse off.
Right. Absolutely. In fact, actually, sorry, just on that note, I remember at our last conference, we had a talk from Raina Abbas, who's based in Lebanon. And of course, while this was all going on, they had that massive explosion downtown as well. And so, and you kind of go, well, yeah. And dealing with that too, a load of offices, including some game studios, were affected by that. But yeah, sorry, carry on. Yeah. No,
so basically, it's we've arrived at a lot of industries are going to move towards working from home, but comics have done that for a while. There's a company called Hiveworks, which is I don't even know if it's American or Korean. It's just because people all over the place, and they're massive. They have huge reader base, but everyone works from home, which is very surprising. They don't have an office, they don't have any of those overheads, and I think that's a lot of more companies are going to do that in the future going forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. Perhaps easier to do on industries like comics and games. But Andy, you mentioned the kind of backlog of kind of production on movie and TV. They've been affected pretty badly, right? I mean, what do you see as happening there? And can technology like the Mandalorian uses save us at this time?
I think so, yeah. And like Unity's coming out with their latest update has like a high definition render pipeline, which can pull in like high def models very quickly. I think we're going to start seeing almost a merge of like game technology coming into like movie and video production space, where we've been doing that for a long time in games. And honestly, only up until recently have we got to the point where we're close to like movie quality. Before it was very like obviously 3D. You could see when low quality rendering software was used in movies and TV and production. I think we're going to start to see a lot more what was seen as like gaming technology pulled into video production.
Yeah. I think you're right. Also, it occurs to me that there are some kind of low tech solutions as well, like production companies going into quarantine together, which I think is happening on some TV studios too. Let me go to Houston next, then I'll come to you then. And what do you take on that? Do you think working culture is going to change?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it has to. I think by necessity. But I don't think technology will save it necessarily. I never have faith in the robots to save us. But I definitely think we're forced to change. I think the biggest thing we have to change is our mindset. The way you think about production, the way you think about ideation and development is now being forced to change. Going back to the last question, just for a second, the biggest losers I think in the pandemic have been people that have all put their eggs in one basket. The single channel entertainment that sort of bet on the wrong horse. I think now the winners going forward are people going to have a more diversified model, and we're going to use technology to be able to develop and produce that way. But at the same time, I think from a creative end, there's something about a writer's room in person that is different than a writer's room on Zoom, and so I think production workflows can be offloaded digitally, but there's just something about the energy that you have in the room with creatives that you just can't duplicate. And so I think we're going to have to figure out how to make provisions for that without giving us all COVID every time we do it. But I think whereas we may see an acceleration of production workflows technologically, I think we may see a step back just creatively, just because we have a disconnect of that person-to-person contact.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what? I'll come to that in a minute. But Lennon, let me come to you next. What's your take on this? What do you see happening here? Change in work culture?
I think there's a change in work culture. Andy, I saw your finger go up. Unless you wanted to talk on that point for a second, I can come back in with my feedback in a second.
No, I was just going to say that anecdotally, I've heard from other teams, like following on from Houston's point, that teams that are going into pre-production and creative, they're having to deal with this, and it's causing a real problem not having that in-person creative kind of buzz that you bouncing off of each other. So that just goes back to the whole like production flow thing. That was I wanted to.
Oh, well, I'll speak on that too for a second, because I think you're right. And I think it's been often said that there are advantages from working from home. It's been observed quite a lot. We miss out on the commute and all that kind of things. But actually, what Andy and Houston both said there's something about working if you are in a collaborative business and you don't get the energy of a room, I think there's a lot of learning that happens in person, right? Just by osmosis. When a creative team is together, junior members of that team learn what a good idea looks like. And they don't maybe get exposed to that when they're working 100 miles away, and that's a problem. Sorry, Lennon, back to you. What was your take on that?
So I would echo some of the thoughts that have already been shared, in that as we've gone through this cycle, there was an initial phase of change and disruption to our usual process. Now there's an acclimatization to working from home and making it work, but there's still that need to be together, and that ability to share and to cooperate and collaborate, and the Hollywood industry has found ways and taken, I think, some lessons from the sports industry in terms of how to keep production moving forward, creating their own production bubbles, especially when you need to have people in the same area to film, right? You can't make a live action movie if you don't have live action actors on the stage and on the set somewhere. So it's really interesting how they've created certain bubble levels, right? So there's a crew level, then there's an actor level, and then there's a director and executive level that comes in, and there's a lot more COVID testing that's happened. But what you're also seeing is a decrease in efficiency. You can't produce as much content if the process and the gates to make all that content are spaced out over a longer period of time. And with that inefficiency, you have to wonder what's going to fill that void, because we still want to consume all this content. And what we don't talk about, and I don't think was as much of a focus here, is also all of those other spaces of UGC content that are coming in, right? TikTok taking a huge portion of mind share and time share. And of course, YouTube still being the behemoth that it is to counter all of the production level AAA quality grade content that's out there.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. Huge boost in kind of podcasts as well this year as well, kind of amateur recording at home. Let me go to a slightly more qualitative thought. This is a tricky one, and it may well be that we can't reach a conclusion here. But it's worth talking about. We've spoken a little bit about distribution and production, and I will definitely talk about business in a minute. But just from a kind of a storytelling point of view, is a year like this year, with all its pandemics and politics, going to have an effect on the kind of stories we tell each other? Are we about to enter a golden age of dystopian fiction? What does anyone think about that? Houston, back to you. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I actually think it's the opposite. I think usually when you look at the trends, when everybody's depressed, you're looking for escapism, and things get lighter. When everything is nice and good, that's when people kind of lean into the dystopia, and it's always sort of this really interesting inverse of what the reality is, because I think entertainment always should, it always pushes the opposite way in a way. I mean, there was I can't remember the name of the movie, a new Michael Bay movie coming out about COVID-23, and set a few years in the future, and how COVID-23 is now ravaging the world, and we've been on week 291 of lockdowns, and I watched that trailer and I was like way too soon. Way too soon, right. And it's like, it's so bleak and it's so hopeless, and it it looks like a good movie, but it's just like, I don't think we're ready for that. So I think in times of crisis, human beings always look for hope, and that's just how we're wired. So I think that the more people lean into the darkness and lean into the dystopia, I think you'll see that not be received as well from audiences. I think the people that kind of shine a light in the darkness, we're going to go a little bit more toward that. At least that's my prediction.
No, that's interesting. And I think we've got a lot of stories coming our way from places like Netflix. The Lord of the Rings prequels and more Witcher and things like that. A fantasy thing. Neil, yourself working in comics, do you see a change in the stories that are being created this year? How are things going? Would you echo that thought?
I think Houston nails on the head. I actually had an enormous number of emails from people saying we should write something about the pandemic. And I thought, well, that alone, the sheer number of people telling me I should means I shouldn't. Right. I think it is far too soon. I've got nothing more to add to Houston. Well said.
Yeah, that sounds like. I don't know, Andy or Leonard, do you want to chip in on that, or do you think we've covered that topic, or do you have any take on the kind of qualitative aspect of where stories are going?
No, you go first, Leonard.
Well, I was going to pass the baton to you because I'm not the storyteller.
Yeah.
I'll take the chime on the business conversation later on down the road.
Okay, mate. I was just going to add in that I had read somewhere recently that Amazon Studios had released Utopia, which was about dystopian. It was about now, but it's a bunch of people who had found viruses and end of the world that were coming in a graphic novel in comics. Okay. And I'd read an article saying that it had not performed as well due to people being locked up or locked down due to this year. So I think that's actual evidence of exactly what Houston was saying.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. So I think we're probably kind of all in agreement there. Let's dive into the kind of business side then. Now that we're, being 2020 being what it is this a particularly good time or a bad time to seek investment for a product? Let's say there's someone in our audience here who's working on a project. It might be a games project, it might be a comic. I don't know what to tell you. Whatever. Should they be waiting until things have quieted down before they start pitching investors, or is this the perfect time to do it? I don't know. What do you think, Leonard?
I would think that actually, if you're working on a game project, there's probably never been a better time. There is so much of a shift in industry into bringing some capital markets into the gaming space more than there has been in the years past, and particularly on the mobile side as well. So it's definitely a good time to use some of your spare time and think about new ideas. Often they say that in times of economic pullback, that's when most of the creativity happens, and people find themselves exploring new ideas and new concepts, and that's really where you see these new uplifts and what carries through the next growth stage. So there's a lot of capital coming into the gaming space, and there's a lot of folks who are looking to move there. Obviously, we have Stillfront as a great example of a company that kind of pulled themselves together in the earlier stage of the year, and have been on the acquisition trend. Zynga still going very, very strong. Of course, there's Scopely as well that are moving really quickly into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing lots of mergers and acquisitions, definitely. What does anyone else think from their own disciplines that they work in? Are you seeing this as a particularly good time to seek investment for a project, or set up a business? Neil, what's your take on the kind of comics and publishing side of things? Do you see this as a good time to be launching and building a business?
It's a tricky one, because I do agree that there's always opportunity in down periods. But in DC Comics announced yesterday that they culled a third of their staff.
Wow.
It's and with comic stores with still not opening up, that's sort of lifeblood for the comics industry. And so if you're not making a profit, yes, you may get big fish investors who may want to put money in, but is it the right thing to have? I'd focus more on quality rather than quantity for a start. What I will say is that some of the comic industry relies on sort of small-time investors having a large pool of them. And those people right now may be struggling financially or be risk uncertain. So that pool is definitely going away. But there's always investors who are looking to branch out into new areas. And as long as you have a good product and a good team, there's never a bad time to seek investment.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, is that something that chimes with you as well?
I would just guess that now would be a great time to invest in games. I can't really add to the conversation on this, though.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah. I think there's I don't know, Houston, if you've got a take on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is, so in addition to all my transmedia work, I'm also an attorney. So this is a very attorney answer. It depends. It depends what kind of business you're trying to get an investment for. I think there's always going to be like Lennon and Neil said, there's always going to be companies that see a downturn in the economy as sort of a half off sale to be able to be aggressive to go in and invest in some new things. But overall, I think what you're forced to do as a creator now is to figure out how to hedge the investment as much as you can. I think people run too early to investors without having any sort of market presence. I think they put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. I mean, we've all heard that term. Make sure you have a diversified portfolio when it comes to stockbroker wisdom. I think now when you're putting together a business model, looking for investment, making sure you have a diversified portfolio of offerings, so that investor sees a decrease in the risk of that. So I think a lot of people that are still single channel that are running to get investments from maybe some investors that don't have that risk appetite. I mean, there may be big investment firms that change the equation, but a lot of times these investors are just like the private equity investors, just like a rich orthodontist down your street that has some cash they're looking to do something with, and a lot of times independent creators look to those folks for capital to launch. And I think you really have to now consider, obviously you got to consider quality of your product, but you also have to consider how to decrease that risk as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, again, this is hedging your bets, but it feels like maybe it's a great time to seek investment for a great project, and not a great time to seek investment for a risky project.
Yeah, 100%.
This is, tell you what, I just want to remind everyone who's watching this in the audience that we can take some questions at the end too. So do pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom there, and I'll get to those as they come up. But what I'd like to ask now is, just like to refer back, the UK government implied that those who work in the media and creative arts should start retraining for new careers. That was hit the news last month to much derision from people, particularly at a time when people were turning to the media and the creative arts and the media for solace. But does that, were they right? Does that mean that that new startups are going to pop up? Does it mean that we're going to see a brain drain from the creative arts as we all have to start retraining as I don't know, people work in retail or something. Probably not that, given the current crisis. Not that. Another thing altogether. So what does that mean? Does the fact that the governments are suggesting that if you work in the arts, you need to retrain? Was there any kind of were they wrong, as they have been in other areas of the thing? Andy, what do you reckon? Did you follow that news, and did that make any sense to you?
I didn't see that. I was quite surprised by that, being an expat. All I can think is maybe they're thinking of like extension things like theatre that are really
right,
and maybe there are not as many jobs out there because it takes much more investment, both time and money, and resources to set up and run projects virtually. Everyone's on Zoom meetings more than they are working most of the time, which also has an impact on output and finishing projects. So maybe that's what they're hinting at. I can't see that everybody would need to retrain, because it would be a really bland world if there wasn't any entertainment out there.
Right, exactly. As well. Neil, you're based in the UK. Did you see that news? Did that strike any kind of emotion in you?
Yes, I thought it was a very insensitive comment, and but I also think there are a lot of people who. So if you're entrenched in this, and that's your business, you're not going to give up and go away for it. But there are a lot of people who are starting off in it, or at the low end of it, and they're not making much money, just getting by. And if it's shrinking, and it's going to be shrinking for the future, it's maybe in the short term in your best interest to look after yourself. It's like, what is the downside, and what do you want long term? You have to. It's a balance, and that's what he was trying to do to make sure the economy stays on track. So I can understand why he said it, but at the same time, it was hurtful to a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. Houston or Lennon, I don't know whether either of you wants to leap in on this. I don't know whether you saw that news, but what, just generally as a principle, do you kind of agree with what we said there? Are we looking at a good time for seeking careers in the creative arts, or should people start retraining?
I wouldn't. I would certainly not encourage people to think that the media and creative arts are coming to an end. If anything, I would be leveraging all of the experience that you have to rethink what is the next step for you in media and the creative arts. Because when things go through dynamic times like this and there's such change happening, where do you reallocate yourself to capture the next wave of content creation and content consumption, right? If content moves from art galleries into Etsy, well, what are you doing along that chain to be part of that program? If cinema goes from all AAA production to more animation because it's able to be done digitally, well, what are you doing to reshift your career is perhaps a better way of thinking about it than to think about exiting to go into certainly not retail, but
certainly not retail, but
sure.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Houston, do you concur?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think we've been having this conversation for the past 10 years. I mean, outside of the pandemic, I mean, we've seen AI and machine learning begin to disrupt jobs in entertainment. I mean, we're getting to the point where AI can mix and master a record. What's going to happen when AI can color correct a film, and when AI can, we laugh at the scripts that the AI puts out right now. But what happens in 10 years when an AI can actually write a really good script? How does that disrupt? So we've been talking about creative arts disruption for a while. The pandemic accelerated that. So I think that humans will always need entertainment, and that the entertainment market will never leave. But when it comes to a career move, what I always say, because listen, truck drivers in Pennsylvania are now facing the same problem as the entertainment industry. What happens when you have driverless trucks and their jobs are disrupted? This is the story of humanity. There's an industry that gets disrupted because of some crazy thing, and people have to retrain. So this is why I particularly advocate for, I always talk about how to diversify your entertainment. I think you should diversify your career as a creative professional. I mean, people ask me what I do. And I say, well, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a creator, I'm an author, I'm an educator, I'm a consultant, right? And so all of a sudden, if one of those things gets disrupted, I can lean back on the other four. I think now you're going to see more of a nimbleness when it comes to creative. So I always, when I talk to creators, I'm like, hey, if you have an expertise, write a book. have a master class, figure out, a local college you can go teach at, and also create at the same time. Because again, I keep going back to this thing, all the eggs in one basket, as we see in a volatile world, that's just not a good creative strategy, and it's not a good career strategy either. Absolutely.
At the top of this afternoon's sessions, we had a talk from Anthony Johnston, who wrote the story that became Atomic Blonde, and the Charlize Theron movie. And he was talking about how he's taken his career as a writer, which is what he wanted to do, across. Okay, so he wrote articles for magazines, he wrote games, he wrote books, he wrote comics, he wrote web comics, and now he writes screenwriters. And it's the same skill, but he's looking at all the different disciplines. I will just remind everyone in the audience, we've got a few minutes left, but we're coming to the end. The time flies by, so do drop any questions in you have. I'm going to go around and ask the people here, for my panelists, for a wild prediction. Okay, what creative industry will have changed the most by this time next year? What do you think is going to change the most? Andy, I'm going to come to you first. Could it be your own industry, or do you see it happening elsewhere? What's going to change the most in the next year?
That's a tricky one. I don't think games, because all of the projects are on track, and most big games are multi-year projects. So in 1 year, it's not really going to make that much of a difference. I think the user creation space, user-generated content, and smaller indie, more nimble projects in different spaces are going to be the things that we're going to see the most disruption from. I think we all hope that this is a blip and we're going to have vaccines and we're going to go back to a relatively normal world after this. So there's going to be some normalization, but there's definitely, we're at a point of some evolution. I don't think you're going to see it from big companies and big projects, because they're typically like 4 or 5 years. So it's not going to come from there.
Interesting. Neil, yourself, what do you think? What's going to change?
It all depends on whether we go back with the vaccine or not. And if not, I mean, the theatre or the music industry, with especially small bands and live acts, it's killing them right now. The honest answer is I'm going to do Houston and say it depends. And I think the main thing is, will we go back to how things were in terms of interacting with humans? And I think just the way humans are wired, we're going to have to. People will just be fed up, and they want to go back. They want to have contact sports. They want to see this. They want to see each other, make friends. How can you date if you can't have any contact with strangers? So I think it will go back to how it is normally. The question is how long it takes. But I think in the short term, I think it's anything that involves people being together, which means music situations or theatre.
Yeah, absolutely. Live events, we see that happening. Lennon, what do you think? What's going to change? What's going to change in the next year?
Well, I think the next year, to everyone else's point, I'm gonna kind of go along with that, is that it really depends on what going back means. If there's a vaccine and everyone is able to get back in the very short term, I think that's very, very different than if things stay status quo all the way through December of next year. Because as that time period extends, habits will eventually form and change. And from a consumption perspective, the more you set yourself up to consume media and arts at home in different ways, the less you're going to be likely to invest in a theater experience. The less you're going to be, the less prone you're going to be to going out to, perhaps not a sporting event, because I think sporting events will always have that certain live presence effect that's just deeper and richer. As well as music concerts, but there are going to be some changes that are going to happen to how you're used to consuming content. And if you've established yourself and you've got your 6 or 7 different streaming subscriptions now set up, and you have a larger screen TV at home, you might enjoy your theater experience so much that you don't necessarily see the value as much as you saw it in the past to go to a theater, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. That's even hoping that the theatres are still with us to enjoy. But you're right. You raised an interesting point there, which we haven't got time to discuss before I go to Houston, which is that whole kind of proliferation of streaming services and even game stores as well has its own challenges, right? As well, I've never had subscribed to so many streaming services, and I don't think that bubble can go any bigger. Houston, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I don't think we'll ever go back in the same way. I think even with the vaccine, you know, the thing that we're dealing with in the States, I mean, last poll that I saw was 80% of Americans now say they're not going to get the vaccine when it comes out. It's like getting the new iPhone when it, as soon as it's released. Everybody wants to wait for, you know, wait a little bit to see how all the bugs are worked out, so to speak. And so, so if that's the case, you know, I don't know. Ticketmaster just announced that they may require proof of COVID vaccine in order to buy tickets to live events. And so I think this vaccine is actually going to be sort of the next battleground of how things are going to swing with live events. So what do I think will change the most? I think theatrical film is the thing that will change the most, because we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. I think my prediction is that we'll pivot to smaller theatrical experiences, maybe not the big multiplex type of thing. I think maybe some more intimate, get 20 friends, get the big screen and do something like that. You know, and then looking back on it, it may be that Avengers Endgame was the last great blockbuster we had, where we could go in with 400 people and really enjoy it, which is an interesting way to go out. But I think film probably is the thing that's going to change the most. I think the things that's going to grow the most is audio. I think podcast in the audio space with Alexa, with Google Home, with what we're seeing going on in podcasts. I think audio is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. I don't know if it'll change as much as just grab more market share as we lean into some different things. But film, I think will probably continue to be disrupted. And it's a bummer, because I have so many friends, working at studios, and Warner just had a massive layoffs. This week, Disney, the same thing, as they pivot into more streaming first companies. It's just, we just don't know what film is going to be like, and I'm not super hopeful that we will know. Even in the next 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Theatrical film release is an interesting thing, because there's an argument to be made, and I've had this conversation with some of my pals here, that maybe that model was always a little bit unsustainable. Spending so many millions on a film, and then expecting people to go and spend $20 for a ticket and buy a bucket of popcorn. Was that ever a good idea? So who knows?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Dave.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to touch on that. We're seeing that a little bit with games as well now, right? Where we're seeing multi-million-dollar games, and the games are like open world and just so big. So we're beginning to see some of that pattern with games as well, the unsustainable model.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we're kind of at the end of our time here, and I know that that I should be wrapping up. Do you know what? I've just realised that I didn't even bring Brexit into the conversation, which that we're heading that way at quite a pace. So look, I'm gonna leave it there. We could have gone on way more. I think we probably only touched on half of the topics I suggested, but I really want to just go around and thank everyone. Houston, Lennon, Neil, Andy, thank you very much